Hi, I'm George Pearson, and these are just a few examples from some of the training videos I have here on YouTube. Now, when you're working with the training, following along the training, if you want to get the materials I used in the training, just go to the description down below and click on the link that's at the top of the description, and this will take you to a page where you can download the materials. Please subscribe, click the like button, and of course always share on Facebook, Twitter, or wherever. I really appreciate that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started with the video. In several of my project videos, I do a lot with patterns. I even try to make some custom patterns. Most of my videos, though, are demonstrated in newer versions of Photoshop Elements. In those videos, most of the instructions apply to the earlier versions as well. You know, how to create the pattern, say the pattern, that kind of stuff. But the basics on how to actually use patterns is different. And that's because in Photoshop Elements 11, Adobe changed the interface. In 11 and on, there is a new panel right down below here which contains all the options for your tools. In version 10 and earlier, we don't have that panel down below. Instead, we have this little thin line right up here, right above the window, kind of a little options menu right here. So here's our main menus, and then right below that, this additional secondary line, and these are the options for the different tools. So let me show you how you can use patterns inside of Photoshop Elements 10, which I'm using right here. This also works for earlier versions of Photoshop Elements as well. So it's kind of Photoshop Elements 10 and earlier on how to use patterns. Let's just close this out, and we'll start with a new file. So File, New, Blank File. And I'll leave this at the default Photoshop Elements size, which is 6x4 and 300 pixels per inch. Choose OK. There we go. Now, to create a pattern, you're going to be using the paint bucket right down there. Now, when you're using the paint bucket in the later versions of Photoshop Elements, you have an option right down below here where the project bin is right now, where on one option is paint, the other option is pattern. You don't have that here. Instead, at the top, in our little options line right here, there's this little pattern and a checkbox. If you check that, that activates the fill. If you uncheck that, then the paint bucket works just as color. Let me show you that. I'll just change our color here to something different. Kind of like that, just a bright orange, and I'll click in here. So that fills it with a bright orange bit of color because I don't have that checked. It's just filling with solid color. Okay, let's just undo the paint bucket and I'll put it back to our default colors. There we go. Now if I click on that checkbox right next to pattern, that activates the patterns in here. If you click on that icon right there, it shows you the different patterns that are available in here. There's our default, that's one that's selected. To choose a different pattern, just click on the pattern and notice how the little window changes up there. So I'll go back to the default. To use a pattern, just take your paint bucket and click inside, and it then fills that with the pattern. Okay, let's just undo that paint bucket. Now there are some more patterns in here. Click on that pattern again, and have a little double arrow over here. Now, earlier versions, again, this is Photoshop Elements 10. Earlier versions had this arrow in black on a dark background. It was very hard to see, but it's still in the same exact place. So you'll find these two little arrows right there. Just earlier versions had those arrows in black instead of white. Click on that double arrow, and that brings up the options in here for the pattern palette. And down here we have artistic surfaces, color paper, default. This is the default set right there. Grayscale, nature patterns, patterns 2, patterns, rock patterns, texture fill, and texture fill 2. Click on one of these. I'll do colored paper, and it brings in those patterns. Now again, earlier versions of Photoshop Elements before this version 10 had fewer patterns available, but they still worked exactly the same. If this is kind of messed up here, just click on default and put that back at the default settings. And that's really all there is to it. You don't need to worry about the mode or opacity or tolerance right now. This is all additional stuff for controlling how it flows in, but I like to do that over here on the layers panel instead of doing it up here at the top. So that's the basics on how to use your patterns. So it's paint bucket and then checkbox for pattern. Click on the pattern drop down, choose your pattern. If you don't see it here, click on that little double arrow, come down here and choose the other set that you want to work from. Let's just come in here and do artistic surfaces, for instance. There we go, and I'll choose that one right there and click in here, and it fills it with that pattern. Okay, so that's the basics on this. Now if we go over here to the stamp tool, which is right here, we have two options, clone stamp and pattern stamp tool. This also uses patterns, and if I scroll here to the right hand side, there's that same pattern drop down box. Click on that and there we go. Notice that it's showing me the exact same patterns that we just used. So I can change my patterns, click on the drop down here, go back down to default, and it gives me the default pattern. So this is all exactly the same as we just saw with the paint bucket. It's just over here instead of being over there, but exactly the same thing aside from that. Okay, so that's how you do a basic pattern fill. Let's do a few more things in here. I'm going to add a colored layer on this just for interest's sake. Let's do a new layer. New layer button right there. There's a new layer. Let's go back over here to our colors and I'll choose something inside of this range. I'm going to uncheck that web colors and just choose something a little more yellow, I think. There we go. Just kind of a buff color in here. Choose OK. And I'll fill this with a paint bucket. So I'll uncheck pattern and fill it. That gives me a solid layer above my pattern layer. Here's one way you can use patterns inside of and to make an interesting content in here for your background. Do a solid color layer. Let me just double check this and rename this. Call it solid color. There we go. Choose OK. Right here we have our blending modes. On these I can change how this layer blends with the layer beneath. This is darken. There's multiply, color burn, linear burn. These are all going darker and darker color. And we have lighter colors. Here's lighten, here's screen, here's color dodge. You don't see much there. Linear dodge, add, lighter color. And then we have overlay and soft light and hard light. So lots of options up here, and these control how this layer blends in with the layer underneath. So I'll be using the hard light one here. So we're seeing the texture through this color, and it looks like some kind of textured paper or textured surface. This is just one way to colorize a background. Let's now put our colors back to our default settings in there. And let's go back to our paint bucket. There we go. Click on pattern again. And I'll put this back at our default. So I go right there. And I'll click on that one. Actually, let's do something totally different. I'm going to do just this kind of gray thing here. Maybe even a blue. Blue's even better. It'll contrast well. So different colored pattern. Let's now do a selection on here. I'm going to grab the elliptical marquee tool. And I'll just do a big ellipse. Just like that. And let's put a new layer in here for this. So I have a selection now. And grab the paint bucket. We have our patterns selected. Click inside that. And notice how the fill fills in the pattern inside of just the selection. So you can use a selection to limit where your patterns are going to. Okay, let's deselect that. Let's do something else. We'll go over here and take a look at our content up here. Click on content. And let's change this to shapes, so it's by type and shapes. Let's get our layers out of the way for a second. There we go. Let's double click on the star right there. That brings the star onto the page. I'll make that a bit bigger. Just grab the control handle on the right hand side, make that larger. And then back to the paint bucket. I'll apply that. There we go, that's fine. Back to the paint bucket. We're still on pattern. We're still using the same pattern here. Click inside the shape and you can fill a shape with a pattern as well, just like filling a selection. So a couple of things you can do. So you can use any of these shapes over here and then fill them with a color, of course, but also you can fill those with a pattern if you want to. All right, let me just close the content down, bring our layers back up again. Let's just hide those two layers. Let's do something a little bit more interesting now. Let's say I wanted to make my own custom pattern on this. You can do that with the Edit and Define Pattern option right there. Let me show you how that's done. Let's say I wanted to have a pattern that was about 200 by 200 pixels. Right now my rulers are set at pixels. Let's just change this to inches. So right click on the ruler and click on inches. And then in Photoshop Elements 10 I can pull in these guidelines. Some of the earlier versions of Photoshop Elements you couldn't pull down guidelines like this, but you could still visualize about where it was. So that just gives me a visual reference in there at 1 inch by 1 inch. Let's go back to our content, and I'm going to just grab a graphic up here, and I'll click through here, a little kitty cat right there. Click on the kitty cat, bring the cat in. I'll put the cat right up here, right inside of that section. I'll resize it a bit, make it pretty good size in there, which is okay. A little bit of cursor key here to kind of center that in my 1 inch by 1 inch area. Let's say I wanted to have this fill this whole thing as a pattern. I can do that by bringing this down. You can do this by going over here and grabbing your crop tool. There we go. I'm just going to crop in right to that 1 inch by 1 inch part. So I have a file which is 1 inch by 1 inch. If I want to have the kitty cat on a clear background, which I think is preferable right now, go to my layers. I'm going to hide everything else. So the only thing showing is the black cat with a transparent background. That's what that checkerboard is all about. That's transparent background. Okay, now let's go up here to Edit, Define Pattern. I'll just call this one Cat 01. Choose OK. I've now defined that as a pattern. Now, before I do anything else, I'm going to go up here to Edit and Undo Crop, and that puts the page back where it was. Okay, now I don't need to have this cat up here any longer. I'm just going to hide the cat. There we go. Let's put a new layer in here, like that. Let me get rid of this content. Double click and close that down. So there's a new layer above our yellow layer. Let's go back to our paint bucket, back to our patterns, and you'll find that new custom pattern will be in at the bottom of whatever pattern set you had up here. So whatever pattern set is here, it'll apply your new pattern inside of that same pattern set. Click on that new pattern, and then just click into the background, and it fills that background with that new pattern which you just made, just like that. There you go. Now if you want to save this pattern so you don't lose it, click on the options, little fast forward kind of icon right there, and come down and choose Save Patterns. And then give your pattern set a name. It's going to be saving it automatically inside of the Photoshop Elements Patterns folder. Call it whatever you want. I'm going to call this one Custom Patterns. There we go. And choose Save. It then saves that custom pattern. Okay, so that's all the basics on how to use patterns. And if you are looking at some of my training for later versions of Photoshop, where I show you how to create custom patterns, everything else in those videos applies to, will work just the same inside of Photoshop Elements version 10 and earlier. The only difference here really is where you're going to find all the pattern stuff, and it's up here, as we just saw, inside of this little option line here, little options, instead of being down here below as it is in Photoshop Elements 11 and later. Okay, now that we've seen how to do this patterns, let's have a little bit of fun with this. I'm going to hide that kitty cat pattern. There we go. I no longer need those guidelines. We're done with that. Let's just clear the guides out. And let's do a frame in here, a new frame. So I'll go back up here to our content, and let's change this back over to shapes. And I'll scroll down. I'm using the wheel on my wheel mouse. I'm just scrolling down. There are some frames down here a little ways. And we'll find a nice frame. And we're just about down to them now. There we go, getting into the frames now. Okay, I'll take this one. It's just a black frame. Double click, and it brings that black shape in. Put that right here. Drag our corner down and make this a nice large frame on the page. Just like that, and choose OK. So there we go. Now we're going to apply a pattern onto this and some coloration and a bevel and emboss and do some other fun stuff with it. Let's close content down. So whenever I do that, the first thing I'll do is I'll make a copy of this shape. So just drag that to the new layer button, which is right down here inside of Photoshop Elements 10. Drag it down onto that button. It gives me a copy. I'll now hide the original. I always do that just as a safety. If I'm going to be doing any changes, I like to save steps so I can always go back to a step without any real problems. Now to do this, we're going to want to convert this and simplify this layer. So right click and simplify. Make it just a regular graphic instead of a shape. Let's now put a fill into here, we'll put a pattern into this. So we'll go over here and click on the paint bucket, and let's choose that pattern right there. It says canvas, and click into the pattern. It just fills it in. Now you can't see it here because it's on a very similar colored background. If I hide that background, you can see it better. There we go. So just filled that with a pattern. I can now use that and make that more interesting. Since we're a straight graphic, I can use some options on that. Go up here to the Enhance menu, come down to Adjust Lighting and Levels. And you'll see here's the levels for that. There's almost no blacks, no darks. It's a whole lot of light stuff. I'm just going to grab the midtones and pull that over like that. And pull the black in a bit. And we just accentuate the coloration of that particular pattern just like that. So I'm just kind of making it richer is all I'm doing. Giving kind of interesting, kind of goldish kind of a look on that. Choose OK. If I bring my yellow background back in again, there we go. So it's a nice, interesting shape and a nice pattern in behind there. And again, all the texture in there is using that pattern fill. Let's apply a bevel and emboss on this. Go up here to Effects, and we want to have the Layer Effects, which is right there, a second option, Layer Styles. Click on that. It's a drop-down list in here. The one you want is Bevels at the top. And I'm going to choose the second one here. It's kind of a double bevel thing. Click on Apply or double click, and it applies that bevel onto that shape. There we go. Okay, so far so good. Everything's looking real nice. I can close the effects down now. Now that I have that much, now I'll go one step further. Take this layer, drag it up here, actually down there to the New Layer button. I keep one thing up because in Photoshop Elements 11 and later they move the New Layer button to the top instead of the bottom, so now it's just used to the top position. Now at this point I have two of these, they're matching on top of each other. Go up here where it says Normal. These are your blending modes. Click on Multiply, and you actually blend those or multiply those two together, giving you almost a wood grained effect in here. So there's the one. Here's our copy, and then I multiply this color into that color, and it gives me this kind of a nice wood grain effect. Okay, let's come back down to this shape, and we'll do a couple more things here. I'm going to take this kitty cat picture I have. I'll double click on that, bring that back up again. This is just one of my cats sleeping. I'll grab that background and drag it over here. There we are. And let's just get rid of that now. No longer need that. Okay, I want to put the cat inside of that frame. And I'll put it inside of the back frame. Now the way I'll do that is, first I'll hold down the Control key and click on the icon right there. That selects that whole layer, as you can see. Then I'll go up here to Edit and Copy. I'll just copy that layer. Let's hide that. I can deselect. Let's come down to this layer. Just say normal blend mode on that one. Grab the magic wand and click inside. That selects just the inside of that frame. I can now, since I copied my cat, I can now paste the cat inside of that selection. That's Edit, Paste into Selection. There we go. Now I can resize this cat. I can actually move it around, or I can even resize that cat a little bit if I want to. Let's go up here to Image and come down to Resize and Scale. That gives me control handles on that. I can now grab the control handles and I can pull that size down a bit to get my cat picture to fit just inside of that window and choose OK. So there we go. There's our cat inside of that window. We can now just deselect that. So fun little stuff as you can see here. And we're using one of those pattern fills in behind for a background. It's a nice way of using that. And then we're using a different pattern fill inside of that shape to give us this kind of a wood grain effect on that shape. One last thing I think I'll do on this one is just to clean the picture up a little bit. Go up to Enhance and Adjust Lighting, Shadows, Highlights. And we'll just lighten the highlights up a little bit in there. So there's before and there's after, making it look a little bit better, a little brighter on those highlights. Maybe a little bit of a contrast shift, just a touch. And choose OK. And there we go. So that's how to use patterns inside of Photoshop Elements 10 and earlier. and also how to create custom patterns like we did back there with that kitty cat. That's simply making your pattern at the size you want it to repeat to, and then edit and define pattern right there. Now that's exactly the same as in my later patterns training. So again, if you watch one of my videos for Photoshop Elements 11 or later, everything else will be the same in those videos except for just how to access the pattern options, and that's right here, paint bucket, and then right up there left hand side. So there we go. That's how to use patterns and create custom patterns inside of Photoshop Elements 10 and earlier. Thank you for watching this special Photoshop photography project video. Don't forget to subscribe so that you will get first notice of new project videos in the future. Just click on this link right here where it says subscribe here. You can get all 12 project videos in this series along with 26 special videos demonstrating the tools and techniques that I used in these projects by clicking on this link right down here. And then thank you again for watching this